Well, LinkedIn. We're having trouble with LinkedIn, but other than that, I believe we're live. So I'll start with a brief intro in Portuguese, and then we'll go on in English. Oi, pessoal. Olá, todo mundo que acompanha o nosso papo de mercado, Fábio Cendão, Fcmlaw. Hoje a gente tem o prazer de receber aqui um convidado internacional, tem vários chapéus. Ele, uma das coisas interessantes que fez foi um Global LegalTech Report, mas também está envolvido no ecossistema de inovação, startups, e a gente está aqui para discutir novos modelos jurídicos. O papo vai ser em inglês, como sempre acontece com os nossos convidados internacionais. Depois, quem quiser procurar no YouTube, né, e não entender toda a parte da conversa, o YouTube transcreve para a gente, e a pedidos a gente pode, inclusive, fazer algumas traduções para o português também. Eu vou falar agora em inglês com o nosso convidado. Welcome, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we usually start with the story of our guest. So please tell us a little bit about you and what you've done and how you got to where you are right now.
Cool. Thank you so much, Gabe, and a real pleasure to be with you and your audience today. It's a Friday evening, so thank you for spending the time with me. So a quick background about me to help you and you guys can contextualize how I see the market. I've worked in the legal industry for over 10 years now as a strategy consultant. And last year, essentially, I've launched Alpha Creates, and we're an innovation strategy and technology consulting firm that specializes in the legal industry. In terms of a geographic breakdown, the majority of the clients that we work with are across the Asia Pacific region. So that stretches from China, Japan, all the way down to Australia and New Zealand geographically. And in terms of the last 10 years, what I've seen in the market and the reason why I've co-founded Alpha Creates is really because 10 years ago, the majority of the strategy work that I was focused on is really been helping law firms, and up to today as well, answering the question of how do we grow. That question has not changed, but in terms of the how, that has changed. So 10 years ago, the majority of the problem set was really around helping law firms with deciding on growth via practice specialization. So we saw a lot of law firms, for example, that essentially grew by the strength that they have in particular practice group, whether you are a telecommunications company focused law firm or a corporate commercial law firm or a deals law firm and so on and so forth. And that transitioned really quickly into client industry specialization, which was the normal sort of trajectory. And what came next in the Australian market context was essentially the nationalization of law firms. So if you look at the Australian market, and it's the same with a lot of the other legal markets as well, you have essentially the top tier firms, and then you have the mid-tier firms. And a lot of the time, 10 years ago, for example, the top tier firms were defined really by their size. And the prevailing idea then is that scale, there's a proper correlation between scale and top tier status, which meant a lot of the mid-tier firms were looking at chasing that scale. And therefore, we were helping a lot of mid-tier firms with nationalization of their practices. It was also because of a couple of factors as well. Clients were looking at a national footprint for some of the practice areas that they are in and some of the client industries as well. So what came next after nationalization was really globalization. So if you turn the clock back to 2013, 2014 for the Australian market context is when we saw a lot of US and UK firms entering the Australian market. And during that time, we were really, really busy with working with Australian law firms in sort of helping their partnerships decide on whether to globalize or not to globalize. And at the same time, we were also working with US and UK firms to help them better understand the Australian market. And this is really because, again, the prevailing thought at the time was that to position for growth in the Asian century, that you need to have a footprint in Australia because of the proximity, as well as the time zone favorability. And also there were sort of prevailing assumption that you could essentially take someone from the Australian market and put that lawyer into any of the Asian markets like Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore, and they could be successful. But the reality is obviously the local markets are just so different. You have different rules around legal advice, and it's hard for international lawyers to obtain licenses to practice local law, for example. So that was what we were working on a lot, 7-8 years ago, which is globalization. And what came next after globalization was really the rise of alternative legal service providers. With globalization, it also meant that we saw the rise of outsourcing outfit like legal process outsourcing providers, where you can do contract review, for example, in places where you have big supply of lawyers, but you can use essentially exchange rate arbitrage and pricing arbitrage, where it can be done at a fraction of what your associate will be charging out for. And during that time as well, we were really busy with working not just with Australian law firms, but international law firms with their international strategy across the Asia-Pac region, which gave me a really good background and understanding into about 12 markets across the region. And what I've realized through that journey as well is that the problem set, again, are quite similar in terms of the questions that get asked, which is around growth, and how do you manage growth. But the way it's expressed in different markets it's expressed differently, completely differently to that challenge. And what came next after essentially globalization and the rise of the new service providers was new law firms, which are essentially secondment service providers, as well as fixed fee legal service providers. And a lot of them essentially leverage out the outsourcing trend that is engulfed the legal market, as well as technology trend. So if you look at the legal tech market, which is what came next, essentially, the majority of the legal tech companies have only entered the market from 2015, 2016 onwards. If you look at the Codex Tech Index, for example, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with the Codex Tech Index, Gabe. Yeah, the majority of the, I think, 1,367 legal tech companies, about 60% or more, have come into the market from 2015, 2016 onwards, which is because of a couple of factors. Firstly, the cost of developing a technology has decreased. It's also because of the rise of cloud computing as well, which means it's a lot easier to install software. And so the portability makes it a lot easier, and the cost of developing is lower, as well as the rise of legal entrepreneurism. So, for example, the Global Legal Tech report that we're currently working on, 70 to 80% of the legal tech founders in Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Africa have actually come from within the legal industry. And that's because for a lot of the time, as a lawyer, you see a lot of inefficiencies and opportunities to address those inefficiencies by using technology. So all of those different forces that I have just described, from practice specialization to sector specialization, nationalization, globalization, the rise of the alternatives in legal process outsourcing companies, secondment services, through to the rise of legal tech, has essentially created a really hyper-competitive environment for law firms, especially for the Australian market context. And some of the top-tier firms, for example, have also started on the innovation journey as a result, as a way to differentiate themselves. And what that means is you're shifting the competitive goalposts to, you're not just, in terms of traditionally, a lot of firms have focused on expertise and then skill and then service and then so on and so forth. The last thing you want to focus on as a differentiation is pricing, because once you start to discount to win market share, you essentially take that out of the equation because you're training the client to essentially buy based on pricing, right? Yes. That's economics. You don't want to be competing on pricing. So they've essentially shifted that competition to innovation, and what that translates to really is helping practices be more efficient, and that's by using process-based thinking, so project management. And even in project management as a discipline in the legal industry as well has gone through a couple of iterations, which is really interesting. And it's also given rise to how you could better leverage technology. And so that system and process-based thinking has enabled lawyers and law firms to look at what they do from a process basis instead of it being a really bespoke type environment.
Do you think it's a generational thing as well? Because one thing that stood out to me is that, as you said, new law firms from 2015 up to this point began to emerge as legal tech firms and not law firms per se, and the new kinds of lawyers taking over, which means is this a more instead of demand-driven change, is also a supply-driven change because new lawyers don't want to be old lawyers?
That's a really good question. So that's a question that we actually answer in the Global Legal Tech report, where we also ask the legal tech companies that participate in the study to help us look at the breakdown of their age group of the the founders of those legal tech companies. And you would think that the majority would be in the age of 30 or younger, but interestingly, in most of the jurisdiction, the majority of the legal tech founders are in the 30 to 40 age category, and in some cases 40 to 50 age category. So it's a combination of a few things. It's a combination of yes, in some markets like Africa, where we have launched a report last month, that the majority of the legal tech founders are from the 30 and below age group. In Asia, it's a combination of 30 to 40 and 40 to 50 age group. In Australia, it's thereabouts as well. So is New Zealand. So you have a combination of those things happening, where there are some senior practitioners in the market who are entrepreneurial, which is why we saw the rise of legal entrepreneurialism. And at the same time, the new generation as well of lawyers who are looking at doing things a bit differently.
Interesting. And are those middle-aged lawyers like myself, are they tech-enabled, or are they more just the entrepreneur type and they rely on someone with the tech skills?
Again, that's such a good question, which is one thing that we ask the legal tech companies as well, which is, do your legal tech founders, do they have programming skills? If yes, are they intermediate? Are they novice, or are they experts, right? And the answer is it really depends. You get a mix of both legal tech founders who are programmers, so tech enabled to your point, and those who are not. And to be honest, being a tech enabled lawyer, and it comes back to the whole question that I saw the market was asking last year, which is, do lawyers need to learn coding? Really, you don't need to learn coding. It's sort of like when you think about, in a house where you are right now, switching on and off a light, right? You don't need to be an electrical engineer to understand how electricity works, right? It does help to translate the problem set to the programmers and coders, but it's not necessarily a skill set that lawyers really need to have. It's a system-based thinking that's so much more important because it helps you define the stages and also define the problems that you face in each stage of the process for the programmers to be able to code for, right? So it's a mix of both.
Well, that's amazing, because the systems thinking was another thing that stood out for me from your exposition so far. And systems thinking, when you say systems thinking about technology, I immediately think about lean and the combo lean agile, but especially lean methodologies. And that's something still anathema for many law firms to think about it. And so the question is, do you see that shifting from the priorities of law firms? So if it's not properly a skill set in terms of being tech-enabled or learning to code, as you said, is it a shifting in how we do the legal business model?
Yeah, so it depends. A lot of the trends that we are seeing, for example, I see a ripple down effect in the market where essentially you start really at the top tier because the majority of the time they're the ones who define the strategic competitive goalposts for that particular sort of local market environment. And because the majority of the time the top tier law firms in their categories have had to compete not just with their domestic competitors, but also the international competitors. And that's where you see cross-pollination of ideas at the global level. And at most of the time, the international law firms that are exposed to all those different jurisdictions and different ideas, they're competing for multinational companies, right? Who have essentially large annual legal spend. With the GFC, and this is with the GFC, essentially introduces disciplined thinking around how do we better manage legal spending. And that pressure has been essentially passed on to the law firms, which meant they have had to basically come to the client's challenge, which is how do we better manage our legal spend? So they have had to use process thinking, systems thinking, and technology to better enable themselves. Previously, it was basically outsourcing before technology because that was the prevailing sort of practice. And what that's done essentially is the rest of the market who are competing with the top tier firms. So the top tier firms don't just compete in a top tier segment of the market. They also have practices where they compete with the mid-tier segment of the market. So the mid-tier segment then sees how their competitors in the top tier are so much more efficient that they have to come up to the challenge, which then pull the rest of the market with them. And that's how I see the evolution happening of the top tier rippling down those trends to the mid-tier and the rest of the market.
So it is not an effect of competition from the bottom. It's actually a ripple down effect from top tier firms that had to learn to cope with new business model as required by top tier clients like
That's correct.
Startups and tech companies. It's not an effect of competition per se, but actually is a direct demand from the client.
The client, absolutely. Okay. And also the reason I say that as well is I wonder if it's the same for you guys, what you're seeing in your regions, but the last 2 years, there was a lot of innovation by press release, essentially. And what I mean by that is you see firms doing press release about how they're using an artificial intelligence tool.
Yes.
And that's not innovation, that's consumption. And that's something that my co-founder likes to say a lot and points out, Graham, that we're not looking, that's not innovation. We're actually just looking at consumption. It's literally the same as me saying, hey guys, I am using an artificial intelligence, right? Well, yes, there's AI in my iPhone because of Siri and all of other tools that you have in there, but it's just consumption. It's not really innovation. Yes. Innovation is where you're actually looking at leveraging technology. And what that meant as well with all those press releases, as well as the rest of the market have a bit of a FOMO, so fear of missing out, which is why they would then go on to say, hey, let's look at the artificial intelligence solutions as well. And that's a problem set that we see a lot at Alpha Creates, which is you have firms who essentially subscribe to a particular product thinking that, our competitors are doing it, so we have to do it as well, right? And what then tends to happen is that they start the technology journey with firstly the technology, and then retrofit that technology to the problem before looking at their processes and finally change management with the people, right? And that's always going to fail, because you really have to start with defining the problem. How the people are currently working to solve the problem, right, in their sort of no-tech, low-tech way, high-tech way, before looking at your processes. In some cases, a matter of tweaking your process is more than sufficient to solve that particular problem. And then finally, you look at technology and what's out there to enable the process and the people to solve the problem.
Yeah, so it's a problem first, not technology first.
Absolutely. Technology is last because it's an enabler. It shouldn't be at the center of the problem-solving mechanism. It should be the enabler of the process and the people to solve the problem.
And who's doing it really well, in your opinion? Like putting the technology right to solve the right problem, and creating, and in that answer, if you could mention some of the products that you've seen in the legal space that are interesting.
So in terms of who's doing really, it's hard to what I see as a common thread for a lot of the firms who are doing really well is that they have been on this journey a lot longer. So which means they have had the lessons learned, they have had scars to show. The other side to that is when you think about technology journey or the process of innovation, right? It's a journey. It's not a destination. It's a continuous process that happens. And what that means is you really need long-term thinking, as well as senior management buy-in from the partnership as well, to be on that journey. Out of, let's say, 10 innovation projects, you might not get all 10 or 70% of them right. It's a continuous process of learning and internalizing those learning. The other question you have around what are some of the technologies out there, there's actually been an explosion in the diversity of technology in the markets. And the other reason behind that is, as well as I mentioned before, is developments in technology has absolutely advanced, and we're starting to see those advancements being applied in the legal market, basically. So, for example, we talk a lot in the legal media. If you consume any legal media publication in the last sort of 24 months, you'll see headline-grabbing articles like how artificial intelligence is going to replace lawyers, or robo-lawyers are going to replace lawyers. The reality as well, again, this is through the research that we've done with the Global Legal Tech Report, is that artificial intelligence is not the main underlying technology that drives the legal tech solutions in the market. It's less sexy than that. It's programming codes, database programs, pre-programmed codes. Those are the ones that make up the majority of the underlying technology for the legal tech solutions in the market. But artificial intelligence is basically the third most used underlying technology, and that's because it's still in its early development, really. When you think about artificial intelligence as well, with machine learning, for example, you need a lot of data set to be able to train the machine.
It's really hard to do that, to do something useful.
Absolutely. And the thing is, when you think about firms as well, where do all those training data set actually sit, right? Yes. Majority of time, they still need to figure out where do those data sit, so that we can actually look at what we've done previously and teach the machine. Again, that's the other problem that a lot of firms were facing when they were chasing artificial intelligence 2 years ago. They subscribe to a particular product, but they learn quickly that, okay, you need to train the product. Where's all our data set? Don't know. Well, we're going to find out.
Apparently I'm having some trouble with my audio. I'll try to change the configurations next time we talk, but can you hear me well?
I can hear you really well.
Awesome. So moving forward, and so what kind? We talk about products. And you mentioned alternative service providers. Can you talk a little bit more about what they are and how do they compare to legal tech and new law firms? So those three models that you mentioned.
So in terms of the alternative legal service providers, they're essentially, traditionally, a lot of that really follows the different waves that has shaped the market. So you have firstly outsourcing trend that came in the 2000s and 2010s that gave birth to legal process outsourcing companies. And then you have lawyers at common services, so the Axioms of the world or the lawyers on demand of the world. And then you have legal tech service providers, right? But the thing that gets missed a lot of the time is that the majority of the legal tech service providers don't actually provide legal advice. They enable the lawyers to provide legal advice. You have legal process outsourcing providers who also do not provide legal advice. They help with legal analysis, which previously would have been done by an associate or a paralegal at a much higher rate. And then even with lawyers to common services as well, they don't necessarily provide legal advice. A lot of time they are that contract lawyers that legal departments need. Instead of hiring someone full-time, you can get access to contract lawyers who are really well-trained essentially on projects. Or if you think about over the course of a year for legal departments, you have the peaks and troughs in sort of workloads. Instead of hiring for the peak, you can actually hire your workforce in the legal department for the middle, and then manage your peaks with contract lawyers, basically. And also, if you break down legal departments' internal legal expenditure as well, we've done this research for the Australian market. And you see really quickly, 88% of an internal legal expenditure is really tied to lawyer salaries and training, right? So what that means is what they can control is lawyer salaries, and therefore managing that workforce a lot better. So you can access, contract service, lawyer services, and therefore those are how those three alternative legal service providers has shaped the market. There's a fourth category, which is where it's a law firm. Traditionally, you would define it as a law firm that now leverages technology in how they deliver the service, that also leverages contract services or outsourcing services. And majority of the time in this fourth category, they also provide fixed fees as well in the service that they provide, which is completely different to a traditional sort of hourly based billing model that we see that prevails in traditional law firms.
I was going to ask you a question about the billable hour. So I want you to jump in on that. Do you see? Are you as adamant as Susskind, for instance, who says that the billable hour will die, or because it is at the same time that you see that it's not attached to the actual value that you provide. It's some clients actually find it useful for lots of reasons, so that they can measure, they're used to it. So it's more complicated. It's troublesome, but it's really complicated. And I know how big a question that is, and I'll let you answer it.
So hourly billing, it has had a really interesting sort of history in the legal market, right? When you think about it, so essentially at the core of it, it's billing based on input. And how do you measure the value of a lawyer? Traditionally, it's really based on the hours worked for a particular client. And when you think about on the buyer side of the equation, to your point, the majority of the lawyers that are in legal departments have come from a law firm environment, and therefore they're used to timesheets and they're used to how law firms charge. So when they move to the buyer side of the equation, they still apply the same metric on the law firms that they work with. But that's slowly changing as well. There's some instances, it comes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is where you have large organization with consistently large annual legal expenditure. And there's some segments of the market where you're seeing fixed fees coming through, where it's high volume work. Instead of charging on an hourly basis, those legal departments and organizations essentially turn to their service providers and say, hey, for you guys to continue to be our service provider of choice, instead of charging us an hourly rate or daily rate, we're only going to be doing a fixed fee per project or per matter, because we're sending 20, 30, 50 matters a week to you guys. And it's quite consistently quite similar. And those are the places where we as Alpha Creates are finding opportunities for efficiency, because with fixed fees, what that means is any time savings that you get or cost savings that you get is essentially profit. But in an hourly billing model, it's slightly different. It's super challenging to introduce efficiency, because the less time you spend on a matter, the less you're charging out to your clients. And those are the conversations I've had with management.
And grunt work pays extremely well on those kinds of sets.
Absolutely, right? And in terms, and therefore, it's a impediment or barrier to a lot of the adoptions that need to happen with system thinking or innovation. But at the same time, there's also a place for hourly billing as well in the market. Not majority of the time, but some sort of instances, it really does make sense to have hourly billing instead of fixed fees, where you're not sure about the longevity of the matter, right? Litigation potentially, for example, high value strategic advisory work, for example, there's a place for it. But as what we're seeing is essentially there will be, just like how we saw with the increasing diversity in the supply side of the equation, from traditionally just law firms to new law firms to alternative legal service providers to fixed fees, and then lawyers to common legal process outsourcing. The pricing model, we're going to basically see a diversity of pricing models entering the market as well.
And in the pricing model, are also the top tier firms leading the pack?
It's a combination. The majority of the time, it's still the clients who are the ones pushing it. The law firms aren't necessarily going to, kill the goose that lays a golden egg for them, right?
Yeah. So I know you have some videos, like a presentation that you mentioned. I do want to provide you with the opportunity to show that to us. It might be really interesting.
Yeah, I think at the start of our conversation in preparation for this session is we talked a little bit about the Asia Pacific market. Yes. and what are some of the trends. So I thought it'd be interesting to sort of share what's actually happening in sort of this part of the world. So let me know once you can see a share screen.
Yeah, I think it's showing.
Okay, cool. So essentially, when you think about the Asia Pacific market, it's a market that's home to 2.62 million lawyers. And you have different markets with different sizes as well. So for example, how many lawyers are there in your jurisdiction, Gabriel?
1,200,000.
That's really big.
Yes.
When you think about it.
Yes, we do have excess capacity in terms of law. Which is it's a problem. I'm going to ask you about that. What's the perspective for a new graduate in law in Asia Pacific? That might be interesting to reach. But in Brazil, we have 1,200,000.
And that's such an interesting sort of statistic, because if you look at India, for example, with 1.7 million lawyers, they're finding it really hard to track the lawyers, because you have a lot of people coming through from, to your point, law schools, and not many of them actually stay in the legal industry. A lot of them actually leave the legal industry and do something else. And it goes to show as well why you see some markets like India being legal process outsourcing hub for not just the Asia Pac, but also the world as well. Because there's a massive supply of lawyers that are high quality lawyers, but because of labor and exchange rate arbitrage, that you can actually get access to them. But yeah, so you have markets like that, and you have other much smaller markets with only a few hundred lawyers, like in Brunei, for example, there's only 129 lawyers, or in Macau with 416, or Laos with 243. So in Australia, we have 79,256 lawyers. It's basically a heterogeneous group of markets at different stages of development. China has more than 300,000 lawyers, for example. And when you think about, which is what I come back to earlier about innovation and how it's driven by the large top tier firms, what we've done as well is we've looked at whether the 10 largest law firms in each of those jurisdictions have had formalized an innovation function. And that really starts to show you sort of the maturity of each of those local markets, where you have some like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Thailand, where more than 70% of the 10 largest law firms have now formalized their innovation function. And then you have others who are at about 50%, 40%, and 50% in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Japan. And the rest basically with less than 10%, 30%, and so on and so forth. So you start to see and appreciate sort of innovation in its adoption. It's currently at different stages across the Asia Pacific region. And it's expressed differently as well. So you have some, for example, who have launched their own legal tech arm. So instead of buying technology solutions, they're developing their own technology solutions. There's some as well who have established their own sort of NewLaw services, so lawyers and common services across the region. Then there are others who have also started legal incubators and accelerators as well. And then those who are investing in legal tech companies. And that starts to show again, like legal innovation, when it touches legal tech, it's so diverse in the market.
That's really interesting. Interesting.
Absolutely, and that's just sort of to show you some examples of what we're seeing with.
And really useful the way you, as I said, the way you classify those different approaches. It's really useful.
Yeah, and you can start to see sort of like how they are different, and what are the common thread across them, right?
Yes.
Whether it's developing a technology, or whether it's developing a new law services, or creating an incubator and accelerator. Are you guys seeing incubators and accelerators by law firms in your markets?
Yes, we have some big law firms, and we ourselves did incubate a couple of initiatives, and we're planning on doing more on that. And the thing is, we do have, because of regulatory reasons, we can't go really far on that. So usually something related to legal tech or something in-house. But we are lending expertise to other kinds of incubators as well.
Interesting. And that's also partially part of the reason why you see a diversity in terms of how the law firms are innovating as well. There's some who've essentially carved out, for example, in Singapore, there's a local firm called Raja and Tan. And Raja and Tan what they've done is they've carved out the legal tech arm into a separate entity, and it's called Raja and Tan Technologies. And what it's doing basically is to use the entity to develop legal tech and invest and acquire legal tech solutions in the market. And then there is another one, which is a Malaysian-based law firm called Zico that has listed their back office on the stock exchange in Singapore. And what that means is, once they've done that, is they can get access to capital to invest in building solutions for the law firms and their clients. So you're seeing again as well this diversity in the response to the limitations imposed by regulations. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's absolutely interesting to see that happening in the market. And that diversity in itself, I think, is really beautiful to observe.
Do you see a lot of of pressure of traditional and non-traditional lawyers for more restraining in restrictive regulation in Asia Pacific?
That's a really good question. So I'll come to this really quickly, and I'll share with you sort of what I am seeing. Sure. So, for example, so this is basically our last year's research on the legal tech companies across the Asia Pac region. Each of the circle basically shows you the number of legal tech companies. You have Australia with 125, all the way through to those with 1 or 2 legal tech companies in their local jurisdiction.
Is it inversely proportional to number of lawyers?
That's a really good question. The answer is it's not really the case of that. There's actually a couple of factors that drive the number of legal tech companies in the markets. It's a combination of the technology readiness of the legal industry, the supply of talent. So when you think about technology development, you need the tech talent and also legal entrepreneurs in the market as well. And the fourth thing is the question that you just asked me, which is around regulation, right?
Yes.
So for example, in Australia, we have a really open regulator when it comes to the regulation of technology in the legal industry. Instead of having a really pervasive approach to regulation when it comes to the development of legal tech, a lot of the case, what I have seen when I look at the regulated stance is essentially, we're happy for you guys to create a technology solution. We're only going to regulate you based on the code of and regulations that we have already established, which is that the risk, who bears the risk. And it comes back to sort of my point earlier when I say technology is an enabler for lawyers. So in other words, it's still the lawyers who use the technology that provides the legal advice to the clients, right? So the risk is still in the lawyers, not the technology. Yeah. It's the same as when you look at the medical industry as well. We have Meditech, and you have medical practitioners that use the technology, right? It's the regulation still has to be on the practitioner because they're the ones using the tools in the course of providing service in the profession. But there are other jurisdictions as well. So Singapore is a good example of where the Singapore government has put out a vision to basically make Singapore the regional hub for legal tech for the Asia Pac region. And so what they've done essentially is the Law Society of Singapore have introduced grant programs. They had the first grant program was called Tech Start for Law. The second grant program is called Tech Accelerate. And what it does is if you as a law firm in Singapore subscribe to a pre-approved list of legal tech solutions that the Law Society of Singapore has pre-approved with a couple of the ministries in Singapore, that you get a 70% rebate for your first year's subscription costs. Again, if a lot of law firms traditionally would have said, cost is a big impediment for me to subscribe to technology. Well, guess what? In Singapore, that's not really the case anymore. Because you get, I think it was a few $1 million in grants that law firms can subscribe to. And then you have other jurisdictions, for example, in Malaysia, a couple of years ago, the online marketplace, legal marketplace solution providers were essentially provided a cease and desist letter by the Bar Council, because in their view, a marketplace solution for lawyers is in breach of regulation, which is you cannot market legal services. But their interpretation is that because it's so much more conservative, a couple of years ago, that marketplace solution is marketing legal services.
Yeah, we do have these. We do have this in Brazil, and it's interesting because here you see. It's not what I'm telling you is not based on hard data. That's just a general impression. I'm not as precise as you are, but from my point of view, what's happening in Brazil right now, you could see two trends. There was research by the National Chamber of the Brazilian Bar, and they asked lawyers if they wanted the regulations on law, technology, and marketing to change, and a whopping 70-something to 80% of the lawyers said they want to change. So because under current regulations, you would get a similar result as you're describing. And was it which one was the jurisdiction you last mentioned? The one with the cease desist?
Malaysia.
So yeah, so we're Malaysia-like right now in terms of regulation, and at the same time, there's a huge concern of legal technology not being used by lawyers, but being used instead of lawyers. And and here, and from my point of view, that has to do because in Brazil, a lot of legal work here in Brazil is what other jurisdictions would consider paralegal work.
Right.
And so legal technologies help for paralegals mostly, and for grunt work in the beginning of a law career, a legal career. And is that which forces do you see in action in those cases in the Asia Pacific region? Do you think lawyers are afraid of losing their jobs, and are there lots of legal tech emerging that could impede those kinds of things, or for junior lawyers, as is a concern in the U.S., or is it more buzz than actually something that is effectively happening in the market?
So that's a really good point. I mean, a lot of that sentiment, the majority of that fear has really come from, again, what I want to draw on earlier, which is if you consume any legal media publication, unfortunately, if you just read the headlines, you're going to see that lawyers are going to be replaced by technology and artificial intelligence and robo-lawyers. But the reality comes back to what I mentioned as well, is that it's an enabling tool. Obviously, there'll be some parts of the work where instead of spending hours and hours of a lawyer's time into legal research or contract drafting, that once you use the technology, that you become a lot more efficient, right? So it's an enabler that takes inefficiency out of the system. Which on the other side of that, if you think about what is the purpose of the legal profession, it's actually to provide access to lawyers and access to justice ultimately. The cost of legal service is actually really high. And if you use a traditional sort of pricing model, which we spoke about, and the hourly rate, the majority of the population will not be able to have any access to legal services at all. With technology, it's democratizing the costs of legal services, which is ultimately going to be good, because you have greater access to legal services, and therefore you could be servicing a lot more people than you otherwise would have, right? And on the other side of that as well, I'm seeing from the Australian market perspective, there are solutions out there where you could, so document automation solutions essentially. So when you think about, let's say, creating a standardized wills and estate, for example, instead of going to a lawyer, some of the law firms, the alternative legal service providers, have created a self-service website where essentially you could generate a standardized document, but if there's special circumstances, it will then flag that you need a lawyer to advise you in this particular area in terms of your wills and et cetera, et cetera. That's happened. It doesn't kill that law firm that's doing it. It's essentially democratizing their services, and therefore the lawyers are working on much more interesting stuff, right, than just creating a standardized wills and estate document for the client. You're working on more intellectually stimulating stuff.
Yes.
I mean, when you think about fulfillment in the profession as well, it's actually intellectual fulfillment. You don't want to be sitting through and reviewing, 40,000, 50,000 pages of contracts.
Yes.
That's not a profession. Yes, it gives you a job, but that doesn't give you a lot of fulfillment. If you can do that with a machine, it means you have to change your job description and skill set. And ultimately, lawyers are really, really good with analytics. And by analytics, I mean legal analytics, analyzing a case, the parameters of a case, and looking at how you could strategize accordingly. That's the fun part. And that's what technology is here to help us with, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And to follow up on that issue, which skills? So we're seeing the inefficient skills being replaced by machines and legal technology, but and then you have a whole lot of things that technology is enabling lawyers to do, and that requires some other skills. And coding is not necessarily one of them, but which skills are you seeing missing? I mean, what do you think lawyers should focus on learning right now to get the opportunities?
Yeah, I think
another easy question.
Okay, so if I were to take a step back and look at the common thread with sort of where I have found lawyers to be really successful in terms of being open to innovation and process thinking, it is where I don't know about how it is in sort of Latin America or North America, for example, but the majority of the law students in Australia, a big proportion of them, not majority, actually come from they would do a double degree. So a double sort of business and law or humanitarian and law degree. And that's super helpful because it means they're open to discipline beyond just what they have studied. If you look at the legal curriculum as well, traditionally, or what I have been exposed to previously, having come from a business background, a big proportion of my assessment is really in group projects, whereas in a law student's sort of journey, that doesn't necessarily happen all the time. It's you write your paper, your dissertation, and your positioning on the particular case and how you source the case, etc., and use it. That's really individualistic. So a good sort of skill set is as if you're a law student that for your electives, take electives where you're exposed to different professions. That is sort of what I'm seeing is where I found most success, which is lawyers who are open to collaborating and working with others and come out of their own sort of shell, basically. Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear.
That's interesting. I'm glad we're thinking about that as well. We really see in collaboration like the breakthrough of this. I'm particularly very fond of open source methodology and what is done to the business world and to software development. And we even have a legal design course, which is called Open, because of that. So that was a really good validation for us. So Eric, we're reaching the end of this webinar, and we usually ask our guests for a book recommendation and an interesting source of information. It can be a podcast, can be a YouTube video, anything. So one book and one whatever.
That's a really good question. What's one book that I have read recently?
It can be more. You don't have to choose only one, but.
Okay, so I really, because of I guess the strategy work that I do, I've kind of found myself turning back to some of the business books that I read when I was in business school. One is Built to Last by Jim Collins. It's a really good book to look at what are some of the successful traits that define companies that are successful beyond one generation. And when you think about the legal market, for example, so the analogy that's used in Built to Last is essentially you have time-telling companies and clock-building companies, right? Time-telling companies are businesses that are successful because they're only successful one generation because of one really good product or the founder of the business, right? If you look at the legal profession as a whole, the majority of the time we still see surname-driven law firms,
yes,
right? That are successful because of the name partner who built the practice. Some of them are really successful in succession planning. Others have struggled with succession planning. And then you have clock building companies. And I can see that analogy here in the legal market as well, where they are successful beyond multiple economic cycle and product life cycles and beyond multiples of generations of leadership. We see that in the legal profession as well, with large sort of international law firms and multi-jurisdictional and multi-generational law firms. And so what are some of the characteristics that will help define, built to last law firms in the legal market? So you need clock building, basically, law firms that are open to innovation, have the right incentive structure to help the law firms manage that intergenerational sort of exchange, and being open to technology and innovation, right? So that's a book that I turned to recently.
Awesome. Awesome recommendation.
And sorry, what's your next question again?
And another source of information other than a book.
And a source of information other than a book. I have so there's have you seen Bill Henderson's blog, Legal Evolution?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so Bill Henderson curates really good content. He's got really awesome contributors as well. So Jay who is now at Baker McKenzie, she previously was at Sci-Fi Shore, and then she started her own sort of legal analytics company. Got me to Bill Henderson's blog, and it's a lot of really useful information for lawyers who are interested in looking at all the topics that we spoke about before, and the contributors on the side are really awesome in terms of looking at innovation, structural change within the legal industry, technology, process-based thinking, and so on and so forth.
I just posted it, legalevolution.org. That's I like what I'm seeing. I'll go through it. Well, Eric, it was a real pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and amazing work. I'm eager to see the Global Legal Report. I know you're doing a Latin American launch in a couple of days, isn't it?
That's correct. So first of all, thank you so much for having me and for spending a Friday evening with me. Like, that's a much better way to spend your Friday evening, by the way, to spend it with me. But yeah, we are doing a launch of the Global LegalTech Report for the Latin America region on the 10th of September, and it's on the website. So I'll send that link to you so that your audience can subscribe to the event. It's a free event.
Awesome.
And there's a 50% discount code that we'll be sharing at the end of that event if you're interested in buying the report.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm closing the broadcast, and thank you all for viewing this. Please hit like button, follow us, follow our channel for more interesting interviews like this one. Obrigado a todos. Curtam o canal, curtam o vídeo, sigam o canal. E a gente se vê na segunda-feira no próximo Papo de Mercado. So I'm ending the broadcast now.